This is, once again, author and speaker Abdu Murray to my right. And we've got a lot planned for today, but I just wanted to share with everyone who, just real quick, typically people will ask, what do you guys talk about behind the scenes? And it is they typically will think, oh, you must talk about theology all the time or apologetics issues or whatever. And we do a lot of that.
We do indeed.
But on the way here, instead, we talked about Commando, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
Steven Seagal movies. And then I was just seeing a little Paula Cole, I Don't Want to Wait for Our Lives to Be Over.
Which, by the way, actually does have theological significance.
That's true. Well, yeah, go ahead.
So Paula Cole's song, I Don't Want to Wait. If you've heard my testimony, you've heard the story about when I walked into a church service, really for the first time of actually wanting to hear what the message has to say to me. I wasn't a Christian. I wasn't really, I was still sort of reticent to become a Christian. And I remember everything about that particular church service and this particular church that I went to with some friends as a Muslim, had the practice of playing a contemporary song as the sort of walk-in music for people. And it was usually a contemporary song that had some kind of relevance to the message that was being spoken that day. And it was Paula Cole's I Don't Want to Wait. And the whole idea, of course, is don't wait for your life to be over before you make a decision. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the service, the pastor asked a question. He said, God has been leaning on the door of your life for your whole life, and all he's waiting for you to do is stop leaning back. And then if you stop, he'll flood the whole house and clean every room in there one by one over the course of your life. Is that you? And I remember thinking, well, that's definitely me. But I didn't become a Christian that day. What happened was that I decided I need to really find what the truth actually is here, no matter what the consequences might be. So, despite the fact that you and I spent an inordinate amount of time talking about the movie Commando and how unbelievably unrealistic, but how delightfully unrealistic so much of it was, and quoting lines from it, I think I quoted more lines than you did. You recalled the action, I recalled the lines.
Right.
I'm the more cerebral of the two of us.
And I'm more athletic.
So I shouldn't have laughed out loud, but
post-truth.
Lance has pointed out that.
Thanks, Lance. Lance is our video
producer, basically.
Yeah, I don't put a lot of faith in his. He's named after the thing that pierced Jesus' side, so I really don't put a lot of.
Lance, you got to figure out a comeback for that one, my friend. Maybe not right now, but maybe now.
There he is, beautiful Lance.
There he is. Needs all action.
So that's what we talk about.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah,
actually most times.
Yeah. So Greg is joining us today. I'm going to be talking to Greg in a couple days, but
fantastic.
He's here saying these videos are always a highlight of his week, which is a great way to segue into some news we've got.
Yeah,
regarding the show coming up.
Yeah, so I have to apologize to you, Greg. So we do have some news about the show, about Deliberations specifically. As you know, we have the two podcasts, or YouTube shows as well. We have the All Rise, which is taped and recorded, and we react to various videos and these kind of things from a legal perspective. And we also have Deliberations, which is a way for the jury, to deliberate for a whole week over what we talked about in All Rise, and then ask us questions about it. Well, we have been thinking about the mission of our ministry for quite some time, and how these particular YouTube shows fit in to that mission, and should there be some changes coming. Now, before anybody, I say this as if like people are waiting with bated breath, like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen next? But maybe they're not. Maybe you are. But don't panic if you're a fan of the show. Don't panic. It's not going away. Yeah. It's just making a bit of a change. And that change is that we're going to really focus it on our mission, which is to offer the credibility of the gospel to every questioner we encounter. And the idea is we answer people, not questions. And what All Rise in the past has been is answering things from a legal perspective. And I'll always be answering questions from a legal perspective in the sense that I'm a lawyer. I'm trained as a lawyer, and that's just the way I'm built. So I'll always be doing that. And in fact, even in our conversations, whether it's about ridiculous movies or it's about deep things, I'll always say, oh yeah, just like in a jury trial, we'd have this happen. It always comes up. Yeah. So it will keep coming up in All Rise and in Deliberations. But we're going to start to focus on not just the evidential questions.
We'll still be doing those.
Yeah, sure will. Yeah.
Just not, it won't be the every week that's the type of question.
Right. It won't be the only thing we'll be doing. Like, gospel authorship and did Paul and Luke, were they really travel companions? Did Luke get it right? We'll be addressing that stuff, but not only that stuff. We're going to be focusing on cultural apologetics as well. Hot button topics that are really shaping culture and impacting the reception of the credibility of the gospel, but also the transmission of the credibility of the gospel in terms of the way the gospel actually speaks very poignantly, I think, to the pressing issues of our day. Right. So we'll be doing that. And we felt that the format of having to have a legal hook every single time is a little bit constricting. It prevents us from being able to handle these things, and definitely prevents us from being able to handle these things as they arise, because some of these things are hot button topics that's right now. Now, we'll have some hot takes. We're not going to be clickbaity. We're not going to be trying to capitalize on the latest whatever, but we do have to speak to hot button issues as they arise, because Christians can no longer afford, I think, to be so deliberative that we are paralyzed by our analysis of something before we actually say something. Having said that, we are going to strive to always be thoughtful in our responses. So if we're doing something that's more contemporary in terms of the cultural issue, we're going to approach it as thoughtfully as we can in the time we have to prepare for it. Now, as far as deliberations goes, we're still going to be doing deliberations. It just won't be every other week in terms of relative to the previous All Rise. It may be relative to the previous All Rises, plural, as they come out, because they'll still be coming out every other week. But deliberations is going to be about once a month. And we'll be doing various live things, by the way. So this is a teaser. Yeah. We're doing various live things at various times. So we have a scheduled thing with deliberations, but we're going to thinking about whether or not we should do an evening thing or not. By the way, if you have an opinion about this, if you have an opinion about whether or not deliberations, the live portion, should be in the middle of the day like it is, or at night, please send us an email, put a comment in the comment section, or just connect us with us in some way to let us know what your preferences are, what your views are on whether we should do it at night. I'll be doing some Instagram live stuff. Occasionally just sort of impromptu. So if you're following me on Instagram, or I'm also on Threads, by the way. This is apparently everyone's getting on Threads, and so the newest thing is Threads. And I've put one meaningful and two ridiculous comments on Threads just to get the ball rolling. So follow me on Threads as well. But we'll be going live on our various platforms, maybe even a couple of Twitter Spaces and these kind of things to happen in the near future. And YouTube live stuff all of a sudden. So if you subscribe, you'll know that. If you're following us on social media, you'll know that. You won't have to hear about it, but you'll know it right away. So look for some impromptu stuff that's going to be unexpected, but also we're going to make some changes to the format, we think, for the positive. I'm very excited about answering the questions the culture is actually asking in the moment. Yeah. And then bringing in the evidential credibility of the gospel in terms of how, not only historically evidentially and scientifically evidentially, but philosophically and theologically and existentially as well, to answering these deep questions. That's what we're about, and we want to make sure that the videos that we put out and the content the interaction we have with you is commensurate with that mission. So stay tuned for that, and it's coming very, very soon.
Yeah, and so for anyone, this isn't really it's sort of a big shift in the podcast, but it's not a big shift in the ministry of Embrace the Truth or Abdu Murray, because if you're fans of Abdu's, Saving Truth or More Than a White Man's Religion, this is essentially what Abdu's been doing for the past several years now, because you often say that people are no longer asking, is the Bible true? They're asking, is it good? Is it moral? And that brings in to frame these sort of topics that are more cultural, more social, more interpersonal, things like that. So,
well, we have to do this, not just us as a ministry, because that's our mission, but we as a body of believers have to do this, because how often have we either heard it said or had a friend of ours who's a believer in a certain context, and they want to introduce the gospel into a conversation, or they want to introduce their non-believing friends to Christians, and the first thing their non-believing Christian, their non-Christian friends actually say is like, I don't know, what kind of, is that a pastor? I'm not sure I want to meet with a pastor. Or is that is he a serious Christian? I'm not sure I want to meet a serious Christian, because they have a misperception that all Christians are essentially Bible-thumping, beat you over the head with it, judgmental people who just can't wait to tell you how wrong you are and all these other things, as opposed to showing the beauty of the gospel. So we can't afford to not do this. So hopefully you'll think that we're giving you a service in enhancing the podcast this way and the YouTube show this way, and answering the questions the culture is really asking. And judging by the questions we're getting tons of evidential stuff, but we also are in the comments into a lot of our social media posts, for example. There's a lot of theological, a lot of philosophical questions, and a lot of cultural questions as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy the enhanced content.
Especially live Q&As. I know you get a lot of
Oh, yeah.
cultural. I mean, that seems to be on college campuses, which is sort of your heart is to
Yeah.
be there, which is part of also why Abdu is going to be traveling a lot. He's got a lot of speaking engagements coming up. Some of them at college universities, and so the scheduling and live shows a little bit more difficult
Yeah.
to have a set schedule when you're sort of more. The first thing we do is we go meet people where they're at on wherever, but especially college campuses.
Well, that's
So,
why I love Deliberations. I love doing
Yeah.
All Rise, but I love Deliberations because it is a chance,
it's
whether
fun.
it's face to face. Obviously, you're not face to face. I'm looking at a camera right now. I'm stuck looking at Derek's face, but I'm definitely looking at you guys in my mind at the camera. But I like the interaction. And if we have some live stuff, and no matter where you are, it's around the world too. And I like the live interaction, which is why we're called as a ministry you're called to write and to be a part of this and content create and these kind of things. And so we're going to free us up to do that. But the heart of what we do is to be present, looking at somebody eyeball to eyeball, whether it's in a private setting, in a room, or if it's in a larger setting, in an open forum, which we have plenty of coming up at various universities, especially coming up in the fall, and Skeptics Nights at some churches coming up, and we'll be live streaming those things, by the way. We're going to be live streaming that stuff, so you'll be able to watch the live Q&As, interacting with Christians, but especially with non-Christians live, so make sure to look out for those things coming up in the fall. That's the heartbeat of what we want to do. We want to interact with people live, hear their inflection, hear what they have to say, look into their eyes, and try to answer people, not just questions. So we're looking forward to that. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
And by the way, I almost forgot. Next week, on Wednesday of next week, we will be doing something live. It won't be Deliberations specifically, but I'll be joining Chris Brooks, Pastor Christopher Brooks, on his show Equipped, which is a nationally syndicated show on the Moody Radio Network. At 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be doing a live Q&A. We'll both be speaking at a certain place, at Maranatha Bible Conference Center. We'll both be speaking there and tag teaming that all week. And from that location, we'll actually be doing a live Q&A right from there. And if it all works out, and I like to think it might work out, we might even be doing it live on YouTube as well, but it'll definitely be live on the radio. So look for Equipped with Chris Brooks, and I'll be joining him live for a Q&A from the audience, but possibly even from callers in. So if you want to interact with us directly, look for that.
Great. Well, we've got some comments here. I'll just say real quick here. Hello to, I don't know if it's Mary or Marie from Walvis Bay, Namibia.
Namibia?
Yeah.
Wow,
I think that's a new one.
fantastic.
That's a new one.
Absolutely. That's a new one. We haven't gotten Namibia yet.
Yeah. And Philip from South Africa. So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
We're really getting some global.
Yeah, I have
exposure here.
I have some really good friends in South Africa, numerous friends in South Africa, which is really strange because I've only seen them in other countries, either in the U.S. or in Asia or India or something. I've never actually been to South Africa. So if you can think of a reason to get me invited to South Africa, I would love to minister the gospel there and meet you in person.
Yeah. So just jumping into the questions
Yeah.
then. I'm going to read off and then kind of summarize the a question. Really, for the most part, the comments on this one, we really didn't get many sort of, hey, you're wrong on this sort of things. There was a lot of people who appreciated what we said. We're talking today about the episode, on whether Luke Acts is a fiction, based on some of an interview with Paula Fredriksen, who believes that it is because it doesn't appear to her and other critical scholars that the author of Luke, whoever that person was all that familiar with Paul the person or Paul's writings. And so we got this comment from it's IH Fraser 7281. Do you want me to read the whole thing or just summarize it? I forgot what.
I think we have to summarize it if it's a long comment.
Yeah,
I want to be fair to it. We don't want to
Yeah.
mischaracterize, but his comment is there for all to see.
Yeah, everyone can go
So you can see the whole thing. If you think we're not being fair in terms of our response to it, please tell us.
Yeah, but just since we're kind of jumping in late here, so essentially what he's saying is that no record of Paul's martyrdom, because he says we really don't hear anything about Paul's martyrdom until about 95 to 97 A.D. From a letter that has said to be from Clement of Rome. It may have been from the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth, but Clement was thought to be the bishop in Rome at the time. So whatever the case, it comes from right before right at the end of the first century, and it just says that Paul basically died because of the Roman government. And we don't hear anything until maybe late 2nd century, early 3rd century, then about the details of the beheadings and things like that, which as far as I know is true. And so what this person's saying is that since there is no record of Paul's martyrdom, that is proof of a 2nd century gospel, that Luke Acts was written in the 2nd century, so not written by the person we know as Luke. Since a 1st century author whose work, a 1st century author's work could have just been updated a few years later, and they would have done so. So the fact then that, so we take the absence of Paul's martyrdom as proof that it was written sometime before the mid-60s AD, during the persecution. This person is instead saying clearly this 2nd century person didn't know when Paul died, so they just didn't mention it.
And I guess I have an initial reaction to that, and my initial reaction is one, that is objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation. It is just basically rank speculation. You're actually, and this is how this works in the court of law. See, I told you I'd do it. How it works in the court of law is if I was examining you, whether it was in terms of a direct examination where it's open-ended questions or a cross-examination where it's closed-ended questions, and I would ask you, were you in the room with Lance, for example? And you said yes. And I said, was Lance angry during that meeting? The opposing counsel would immediately jump in and say, objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation. And the reason why is because the question is worded so broadly that it suggests that you somehow know how Lance felt with just by itself, like you have some kind of clairvoyance. It's a complete speculation. So I would have to back up, and the judge would sustain that objection, by the way, and the judge would then say, Mr. Murray, lay a foundation. And I'd have to lay a foundation. Say, okay, were you in the room? Yes. Did he say anything? Yes. What did he say in reaction to this other thing that was done or said? And you can say what those things were. From that, did you infer? Did he seem agitated to you? Did, in your opinion, did he raise his voice? And all. See what I'm doing? I'm not actually saying, was he angry? But I'm giving the evidence of what happened so that the jury could reasonably infer from that, was he angry? Otherwise, it's a guess. You're just guessing, or you're asking the jury to guess. In this particular instance, it is rank speculation to say that the gospel author, or the author of Luke and Acts, simply didn't know when Paul died because he didn't mention it. That's a possibility, I suppose, but when you look at everything else, when you look at the actual content of the book of Acts, and let's say, for the sake of this argument, that it was written 2nd century, and all these details, no one really doubts that Paul lived into the 100s. No one thinks that.
Right.
And I don't think this questioner thinks that. All these details about Paul's life, and then this gospel writer and the writer of Acts must have known he died and then just didn't include it because Paul fell off the map. He was no longer important anymore. It just doesn't make any sense given the level of detail of content of all the things that are recorded. And that was the force of our argument. It wasn't just the timing, which, by the way, I think most scholars, skeptical scholars included, would agree, right around the mid-60s or so, Paul likely was beheaded. It's more likely than not, given the evidence we have, that Paul died in the mid-60s at the hands of the Roman government. I don't think anybody really seriously says that probably didn't happen, or it must have happened much, much later. So the evidence we do have that skeptical scholars are actually agreeing with that we do have suggests mid-60s. Given the level of detail of what happened to Paul, his imprisonments, his jailing, his beating, his shipwrecking, and not only Paul, but other people as well, who also went under these things, do we really expect, is it more likely than not, that the writer of Luke and Acts simply didn't know when Paul died and then chose not to include it? And by the way, if it were in fact that kind of a case, you'd expect then the people who did write it later, who did know when Paul died, to edit it back in, and they don't.
Right.
That's the sheer force going on here, is that he's not understanding what's going on. I think there's a misunderstanding what's going on here is we're not arguing that they later edited it. It's absent. So even if it was much later, they would have put it in. Unless you're thinking, no, they thought we need to fool people 2,000 years from now, into thinking that this letter was written contemporaneously with Paul's death, so we're not going to include his death, because they'll wonder, why didn't you include his death?
Right.
That's not what's going to happen here. They're not doing that. What they're doing is recording it as it actually happened, and as they knew about it in terms of what was contemporaneously known. And Paul's death, if Luke was written in the 2nd century, they certainly would have known that Paul had died in some way, and they would have included it, given every other level of detail. Now, the reason why this is important for our discussion, and the reason why I think this objection has some weight we have to respond to, is because part of our argument in the main in our show was that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, can be dated to pretty early, within the 60s, probably A.D., because Acts, which is Luke Part 2, is dated around the 60s or maybe even earlier if we use Paul's death as a benchmark. And if Paul did die in the mid-60s, then we have this timeline we create as lawyers or as law enforcement officers or whatever, a timeline where we backfill what happened down through the line so that the writer of the book of Acts didn't include Paul's death because it didn't happen yet, which means that the book of Acts is probably in the 60s, which means that the Gospel of Luke, which is before the book of Acts, is either in the early 60s or the late 50s. And so this objection is meant to challenge that early dating by saying the earliest record we have of Paul's death is written in the late 90s, close of the 1st century. So we don't really know if Paul died in the 60s or not. Well, we know he didn't die after the 90s because they wouldn't have written about it. And someone could have said, nope, what are you talking about? Paul's still alive. Second, he would be very old because he was probably born around AD 5 or so. They didn't write like we write today, where we have instant news immediately, where the oral traditions in those days were by far the most common way to communicate any news whatsoever. And and you could read a great book by this, by the way, it's called The Jesus Legend by Greg Boyd and Paul Rhodes Eddy, where they talk about, and they have a lengthy treatment on orality studies about oral cultures. Because, I don't know if you know this, but there exist oral cultures today that don't really primarily communicate through written documentation. And in fact, they keep historical records through almost entirely oral means. And their ability to recall details and to recount a story, a lengthy story that is hours and hours long, is amazing. It's our abilities to recall these details, which is atrophied because we now rely on the written word, whether electronic or in print or whatever it might be, or they rely on the oral word. Well, we're talking about an oral culture. If we can take today's oral cultures and extrapolate that level of acumen or that ability to remember things with detail back to a time when writing was not as prevalent as it is today, you can easily see why it is that the tradition around Paul's death persists from the time of Paul's death until it's written down 30 years later. 30 years is not that big of a deal within the traditions of these oral cultures that keep things in such tremendous detail for that long, especially with a known figure like Paul. So I would say that, yes, it's true. The earliest written traditions we have about Paul's death is in the late 90s, but they're basically about his death 30 years earlier, and that is preserved in the oral tradition. So I'm sorry, but the lateness, the seeming lateness of First Clement, where this is referenced, doesn't do anything to impair the case that the skeptic, and including the Christian, and the Christian, have for believing that Paul was martyred or died in some form or fashion in the mid-60s, which puts Acts in the mid-60s at the latest.
Yeah, and there are sort of other clues that this is not made up either. I mean, if you wanted to make up, obviously martyrdom stories were becoming popular. They were a badge of honor, but they were not yet sort of as popular as they would be in sort of this rush to be martyred, like you saw in the early church in some ways. But there was this idea of the clues that are in there. If you wanted to make the worst possible martyrdom story, you'd say Paul was crucified just like his Lord, but instead they said he was beheaded, which we hear as like, oh, that's awful. But that was actually an honorable death, even though he would have been considered dishonorable as a person by Rome. He was a Roman citizen.
So
and they got that right in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, which is a detail that you could see maybe, I don't know what the practice was like then, but the tradition, which even that, when people say the tradition of Paul's martyrdom,
it sounds a little bit too dismissive.
The way we talk about the tradition, no, that's the news. It's not a tradition. It's what happened. There's the thing. I'll say that we talked a little bit about it before, but Carol had a comment here of have other scholars, and she put that in kind of quotation, scare quotes, brought this argument up before, and she's got a good point, because I'm not going to say they're not, they're not scholars, but there are these basically in certain fields, when they're studying this at certain schools, whatever it is, you can essentially make up anything you want about the ancient world, as long as it's not what the church said. So literally the only evidence we have about Paul's death comes from what is written about it in the early church. But people will, the same thing we get with Luke and Acts, people will think that they can somehow read between. You can't tell anything from the lines of the New Testament, but you can read between the lines and figure everything out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of this, when you put it in terms like that, you sort of see like there is a certain ridiculousness to it.
It's skepticism that's transformed into cynicism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think I see that going on here. It's just we have to make sure that Luke, Acts is not based on anything real, because we need everything to sort of be false. And to Carol's other question, Paula Fredriksen has talked about the unreliability of the Gospels as well, other Gospels. But so anyway, just to kind of point that out, when you hear these, just keep in mind, a lot of times what's going on is literally, like in the anonymous Gospels and other episodes we've done, all the evidence we have points to this thing that the church has always said. But it's not very compelling in modern sort of academic circles to have a traditional view on anything. Right. So you have to sort of get out of it in any way you can. It's sort of everything is built on this like stack of cards sort of thing that there's not a firm foundation. It's all built on, I mean, read Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God. That's a book that's all these, well, maybe, might, it could have been, and he builds his whole thesis on essentially whatever the Bible says isn't true, unless it's something that you consider embarrassing today, like the idea that maybe Jesus said the world was going to end and then it didn't. Well, he definitely said that then.
Yeah, because he was wrong.
Because he was wrong. So he definitely said that. That one you can trust.
Right.
So, and I've got an article coming out on that pretty soon about the
looking forward to it.
Failed apocalyptic prophet
Yeah.
claims. But anyway, just wanted to say that, and we see some other questions here.
And just real
Yeah.
quick, this goes. I have a whole all rise. You can't handle the truth about sort of my own skepticism, where I essentially wanted this to be false, and so thought about ways it could be. Here's the reality: there is enough wiggle room in every single argument. As far as I'm aware, there is no knockdown, drag-out argument about which there can never be a question raised. I've never seen a trial where that's happened. I've never seen a case where, as good as the case could possibly be, there wasn't some crack you could put a wedge in it and widen the crack a little more. No matter how good your case is, no matter how righteous your cause is, there's always something someone could point out or criticize about it. And so there's always wiggle room. And in the evidence for the authenticity of Luke or Acts, there's going to be some level of wiggle room to where someone could say, see, that causes me to suspect if it's really true or not. Remember something, we're actually using abductive reasoning, which is inference of the best explanation, but we're also using probabilities here, which is what abductive reasoning kind of is you're saying, on balance, given the evidence, yes, you could essentially get away from believing in this if you are willing to go on the small side of the probability. Is there a 15% chance that maybe Luke didn't really know Paul? I don't know. Maybe it's less than that. But if you're willing to go with the 15% and stake your eternal salvation essentially on it, based on, in contrast to the great, I think, the tremendous weight of the evidence, which says that Luke knew who Paul was and accurately recorded what happened to Paul, that's up to you. That is up to you. But let us not get the illusion that we're making those kind of claims based on the historical evidence. We're doing it mostly on our personal preferences. Yeah. And that's the difference. The church didn't, if you believe the church always lies every single time, you'll never believe anything about almost all of history from the inception of the church.
Yeah. Is this an interested party who has some interest in the message that they're telling?
Yeah.
Then you can't trust them.
Well, the Titanic.
Yeah.
The classic example is the Titanic. And I realize this is sort of timely in one sense, but if you look at the disaster of the Titanic, every single detail we have of what happened with the Titanic comes not from forensic evidence, but from eyewitness testimony of those who were there and who were involved and had a vested interest in the story. Do we suddenly think that we can never trust any of the eyewitnesses from the Titanic because, well, they were there and they had an vested interest? To go a little bit more on the extreme side, Holocaust survivors, they were there. Do we think that they're actually making up those stories? No, we're not. Did they have an agenda behind telling that story? They do, and it's a good agenda. And just because they have one doesn't mean we should be skeptical of everything that they think and say. And so we have to guard ourselves. I'm not saying you have to suddenly not be suspicious and not be a critical thinker. Be a critical thinker, but be critical of your own criticality, because you have to make sure that you're doing it as fairly as you possibly can. And that's all we're saying.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. So we also, Philip, we're going to get to your question here real quick. Just wanted to say shout out to Abdu from Irene. Our friend Irene Maddox.
Oh, yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
Irene. Nice to see you here again.
Yes.
And she actually had a really good comment here that it would be like, a book about MLK not mentioning the assassination. If you read a book about MLK that didn't mention the assassination, you would assume they must have no idea, because Paul was a big figure. It was known what happened.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been known what happened. And a big figure to Christians, and clearly whoever wrote Luke Acts knows something about the Christians, who they were, where they went. But you would assume that this must have been written beforehand. And I'm a big
like 1962 or something.
Yeah. And I'm a fan of Bob Dylan, biggest fan probably. But they've written many biographies about him over time. Keeps getting updated because he's still living. Mm-hmm. One day you'll be able to stop the new revelations to some degree, but it does kind of signify the most. If we're going by Occam's razor here, it is sort of what's the simplest solution to this. It must have been written before.
I like that Occam's razor part too, because that's a wonderful way to put it. Occam's razor, if you're not familiar with this, guys, is essentially the philosophical precept that you don't need to multiply explanations when simpler explanations will do. You don't need to keep adding possibilities when the simplest explanation will do, because that means that it's most likely the simplest one. It's I wouldn't say always the case, but usually the simplest explanation is the best explanation. And so in order to believe that the writer of Luke and of Acts didn't really know Paul, you have to add all these things to all these possibilities, as opposed to just believing that maybe he really did know the man and he didn't record his death because it hadn't happened yet. That is the simplest explanation. Instead of adding all this other stuff, you're adding explanations where none are necessary. It could just be this was written at a time when they did not know did not know that he had died, because he had not in fact died.
Yeah. So Philip asked, Paul spoke about Stephen in Acts 22, but is it possible that Paul didn't mention Stephen in the letters because it wasn't that important to Paul, or wasn't as important to Paul as it was to the church at the time? So just wasn't as significant to Paul's mission as it was to the church overall.
I know we had discussed this in preparation for the show. I don't know if we talked about it in the actual show or not, but we may not have. I think we may not have. But as I recall, in the research and the digging through things, a couple of things emerge. Is that the possibility is that this was assumed knowledge. By the time Paul writes in his letters, it's assumed knowledge that Stephen was the first martyr. And so,
Paul starts off with, essentially, I know you've heard, but let me remind you.
Yeah.
And he goes through some details. So they know a lot of his biography already.
Yeah. And so they go through quite a bit of that. He goes through quite a bit of that. Someone might say, well, if he's reminding them, why didn't he remind them of Stephen's thing? Here's my first response to that. I don't know. I'll ask him. And when you get there, you can ask him if you're a believer. I will ask him, why didn't you mention Stephen in that one? We're going to have a lot of time to be able to ask him questions. And so I'll ask him that question. This is the part of the problem with why would or why wouldn't or why didn't questions, is because and we should engage in the speculation because it's intellectually fun.
Yeah.
But drawing conclusions from an absence of something can be dangerous because you're drawing it based on the absence of evidence. Now, if there should be evidence of this, absolutely should be evidence, you would expect this. Like you'd expect you'd expect Luke to actually have recorded Paul's death. Given what else he talks about, the likelihood of not mentioning his death, if it actually had happened by then, is so low that we can make a dating idea here, or a timeline. But this is different because Stephen's martyrdom is not so integral to Paul's pedigree and his credibility as an apostle, as one might think it would be in terms of that detail. Because Paul does mention that he persecuted the church. He does mention that. And I think everyone would have assumed, oh yeah, it's starting with Stephen. Now, it wasn't really starting with Stephen. He was already breathing out murderous threats and these kind of things. But Stephen's martyrdom was certainly a marker here of Paul's important journey to faith. So he does mention it in the generalist sense, but he doesn't mention Stephen by name, maybe because mentioning him by name isn't all that important to the point he's trying to make.
There's no contradiction to what Paul is saying, and that's the challenge. Almost makes it seem like there's a contradiction. Clearly, whoever wrote this wasn't familiar with this writing by Paul, because why didn't he say Stephen? Well, Paul doesn't have to say it every time.
Right.
You might change your testimony depending on the situation. And
there are so many details of my testimony that I almost never mention.
Yeah.
That if someone were to say I was there when this happened, that if you heard a recording of me or saw a transcript of one of my giving my testimony, you'd say clearly the person who wrote that down wasn't familiar with what happened because this other person said this happened and someone's lying here. It could just be that at that particular moment, it's not relevant, the specificity of the person's name. It's not a contradiction, especially when he says, I persecuted the church. That necessarily includes Stephen. So it's not a contradiction. It's just a detail that's not included in that particular moment because for whatever reason, he chooses not to. And all of us, I think everyone watching this can remember times when you didn't forget the detail, you just didn't mention it because it wasn't as critical in the moment for you to have written it down. Especially, and by the way, this is a small point, and maybe it's not all that relevant, but I thought I'd mention it, is it's not like writing materials were just falling off of trees, quite literally. You didn't go to Office Depot or Staples and get a ream of paper. You've got to be judicious in what you put into these things, and so it may have been intentionally left out, and not for redactionary reasons later on, but for reasons of space considerations. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Great question, by the way.
Yeah. Awesome question. And there's Brandon, our friend Brandon,
Hey,
sent us a message with 2 hearts. So he must be a fan of Doctor Who. I don't know if you knew this, but the Doctor has 2 hearts.
I was not aware of that.
I'm sure that's what Brandon is referring
As
to.
much of a sci-fi nerd as I am, and as much of a sci-fi nerd as you're not.
My wife loves Doctor Who.
Oh, okay. Okay,
That's where I get my street cred on all things.
Nothing gives you
It
street
used to be
cred.
very nerdy, but now I've become cool. And
Yeah, apparently it's cool. Like, you know how many people I know who wouldn't ever open a comic book when they were in high school and would laugh at you if you did, now know everything there is to know about their favorite Marvel character. And it's like, wow, how things have changed, how the culture has shifted.
Yeah. By the way, my favorite Marvel character, in case you're wondering, is the Joker. So moving on to
All credibility is lost. I want you to know this now.
yeah, Brandon said Derek read my mind, so I got it. Let's see. So Irene asked a couple of good questions, and we'll kind of jump back and forth. But first, let's go to the one that's talking about Luke here. She asks, many Muslims have said to me that since Luke was not a disciple, Christians should not trust the validity of it to be divinely inspired. What would you say to that?
A couple of things. I don't think you have to be a disciple to be divinely inspired. Where's that written?
Yeah.
There's no rule. See, okay, a couple of things on this. I can go on for a while, but Irene, I'm not going to go on for a while. I'm going to try to be as succinct and pithy as I possibly can be. First, it is a common tactic to take for anybody, Christian, Muslim, atheist, whatever, human being to take, is to look at evidence or look at something through the lens of one's own experience. And so we start to look at sort of an Islamic way you look at revelation. So an Islamic way of revelation, of looking at revelation, the Quran, for example, would be, it is the divine dictation of God from God to the Archangel Gabriel and then to Muhammad, and he spit it out. He spoke it, and it was written down by his followers and these kind of things. This is sort of a common tradition that's not even close to the actual tradition of Islam, but that is the common way most Muslims think of it in the simplistic form. So what Muslims will do is say, well, if you're a Sunni, it's the Sahaba, it's the companions of Muhammad who heard what he said and wrote these things down and preserved it and then memorized these things so that even in the oral tradition it could be memorized and then written down later. And then the hadith, which are the sayings of Muhammad and the recounting of the things that Muhammad did through what's called the Sirah or the biography of Muhammad. All these things were written down by his companions, none of whom are disciples of anything. They're disciples of Muhammad in the sense that they knew him, but no one would say, they might be called the rightly guided ones or whatever, but they're not his family. They're not prophets in their own right, because Muhammad is the last prophet according to Islam. And so who are they? They are his friends. They are his companions. They are people who journeyed with him, so to speak. But oftentimes, what you get is a tradition through the hadith, for example, of thus and so, heard thus this companion of Muhammad say that Muhammad said. So you have this chain of transmission called the isnad. But none of them are divinely inspired. And so even those who memorize the Quran weren't necessarily divinely inspired to memorize the Quran. So the deliverer of the Quran is Muhammad, but none of the transmitters of the Quran are divinely inspired in the sense that they're apostles of any kind. One could argue that God empowered them to remember this book so that it can be preserved. But then if you argue that, then why can't you argue that Luke, though not a disciple, could be inspired to write these things down after having carefully investigated and spoken to those who actually were disciples? There's no reason why this standard should apply to the companions of Muhammad or the friends of the companions of Muhammad, but not also to Luke, that he could be reliable in this sense and just be either divinely inspired or just reliable in general. So if you're looking at it through an Islamic lens, I think that the problem is you're looking at it in terms of Luke has to be to the gospel what Muhammad was to the Quran. And there's no reason to assume that that has to be the rule. God doesn't have to obey that certain rule. And Muslims will impose that rule on you, not out of a nefarious intent or whatever it is, but just because they're used to that level of understanding of what it means to transmit holy words, a holy scripture, as it were. But that is not a rule that everyone has to follow. You don't have to follow that rule. That's the number one thing, is that you don't have to follow that rule. And be careful that someone's not imposing their traditional understanding of something based on their religious tradition on a tradition that's not theirs. There's no reason to do that, and you don't have to follow that rule. And then second thing I would say, I alluded to already before, is that something doesn't have to be divinely inspired for it to be reliable. So I do believe Luke is divinely inspired. I think there's evidence for that. But Luke and Acts don't have to be divinely inspired to be accurate representations of what happened to Jesus. Luke says in the beginning of his gospel that he carefully investigated everything, as others have taken the task of giving an account of what happened to Jesus. He wanted to do an orderly account, having investigated everything carefully, so that Theophilus, this person he's writing to, might know the things in which he has believed. So, absent divine inspiration, that doesn't mean that it's not reliable. There's most Muslims around the world look at all kinds of texts, the hadith, which aren't divinely inspired, biographies of Muhammad, which aren't divinely inspired. No Muslim would ever argue that. Science texts, history texts, all these things. No one would claim these are divinely inspired. Yet, we wouldn't say that they're unreliable either. So just because something might not be divinely inspired doesn't mean it's not reliable. Judge the historical merits of the Gospel of Luke on the historical merits, not on your theological presuppositions. And I think that's the bottom line, I would say, is judge it by its historical merits, not your theological presuppositions against its reliability. See if it is, in and of itself, reliable.
Great. So we've also just want to get to this here. There was one thing I wanted to mention too from the video that we didn't talk about in the episode. But, Paula Fredriksen said, well, the temple authority, the Sanhedrin would have no authority outside of Jerusalem to do anything. They didn't even have any authority over the Essenes just down the road, which is essentially like saying, because the Essenes were kind of an extreme reaction to Rome. There were lots of sort of different Judaisms at the time.
Like the Zealots were as well and all that.
And to me, that's a bit like saying, well, the Catholic Church didn't have any authority over Christians. Look at the Anabaptists. Okay. I mean,
right.
I guess.
So what?
But, so it is a little. Just wanted to sort of again.
Give the context though for why she makes that comment.
Yeah. So she's saying that the idea that they had authority to send Paul out to places outside of Jerusalem and round up Christians and maybe violently accost them in some way. In Stephen's case, he was killed. Whatever's going on there, that they had no authority to do that, but there is debate on exactly how much authority they had. I know Philo of Alexandria says they still had some authority, actually, for capital punishment, which is like what we see in the crucifixion accounts of Jesus. They couldn't specifically kill, but they could
petition Rome
to do it. And there was even, I think it was in the Talmud, says that permission was revoked around 40 years before the destruction of the temple, which would be around the 30s, which was also around the time Paul was going and rounding up people, and because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So there is some proof that they had definitely some local authority and authority outside, because people still respected the temple. Not everyone had the same feelings, but there was also a sort of a shared goal there too. Rome would have probably liked having people from Jerusalem who knew the players going and pointing out and maybe taking care of the people who were spreading this rumor about a new king.
Right.
That may have been something that they would be interested in.
Absolutely, and it seems to me, and this is an important point, is that we often forget that the first Christians were Jewish, and so the Sanhedrin. If you think that they have no authority, I'm not saying Fredriksen is saying this, but if you're implying from what she's saying that the Sanhedrin had no authority outside of Jerusalem, we might be thinking to ourselves, of course, they didn't have authority over non-Jews. And so this idea that they were conscripting Paul to go get these Christians, as if there were a bunch of Roman Christians running around, and he was picking up all these pagans, these Romans who once believed in Jupiter, and all these various Roman gods and goddesses, and now are Christians, and he's rounding them up. That's not what he was doing. He was rounding up Jewish believers in Jesus as the Messiah under the authority of the Sanhedrin. And so that dovetails quite well with the idea that Rome would have been fine with this. Like, you're doing that? Fine, no problem, because this is an upstart thing and it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
It's already been a problem in Jerusalem. I don't want it to be a problem in Rome.
Yeah.
And of course, we know it ended up becoming a problem in Rome.
And Paul has dual citizenship, so he would have been sort of a perfect person
Yeah.
to also carry that
Absolutely.
out.
Everything fits really nicely with
Yeah.
that tradition.
Yeah. By the way, Irene did say DC greater than Marvel. So
You've got a friend in Brandon Cleaver,
Yeah.
by the way, because he is a DC greater than Marvel guy.
I didn't know if she meant the comics or Derek Caldwell.
She might have meant that. She might have meant that.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
sounds like maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But she had another question that on the Gospel of Luke. We've got about 10 minutes left, but
Yeah.
it's a good one while we're on that. I did just want to mention real quick on the comments on the YouTube video, Gregory had a great comment and said that the facts that Christianity was a newer religion, many people couldn't write, and that it was not as convenient to write. Could all explain why the term Christian, because that's one of the clues that allegedly Luke was written in the 2nd century, because he uses the word Christian, which we don't see until the 2nd century,
Right.
if you don't count 1 Peter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he says that this could all explain why the
Sorry,
why
I'm just checking my Instagram for
Abdu's
your
watching the game.
I'm checking your Instagram for my question for any questions, and I haven't seen any yet, and I happen to have posted the wrong thing. That always happens. These things, man.
But essentially, this could all explain why the term Christian could be coined in the 1st century, but not show up
There it is again.
until the next century.
Sorry, guys.
It wasn't like today where you can hashtag something and have it go viral within a few days, basically.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
So timing.
It's a brand new word.
Yeah.
It's Christian.
Oh, yeah.
Is
Oh,
a
absolutely.
brand new word.
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
It's not like it's a word that's been circulating for a while. I mean,
Right.
it takes a while. Now it's so funny. I think about the way my kids, and the way I did it before, and this is how I am incredibly feeling old right now. Is that I remember when slang was something that we would pass around, and a word would catch fire, and then before you knew it, it wouldn't catch fire anymore, and somehow kids knew that. But it took a while for it to fall out of fashion or out of style, and it always is the worst when a parent thinks it's still in style, and then you say that word, and you look incredibly old, and you're thinking to yourself, "You were just saying that last week," and they say, "Yeah, last week," but that's also because of the way things transmit in the social age, where everything is. I mean, television by itself, without even social media, television by itself transmitted this stuff quickly. So if you saw your favorite star being interviewed live and he used a word that was like the new hip word, that became the word instantaneously because a million people saw it at once. So it wasn't even just hashtagging. And now take that and give it a booster rocket. And now it's even faster through social media. So when you extrapolate that backwards towards the 1st century, these words didn't catch on very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't always hip to call people Christians either.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, for some reason the word crunk jumped to mind as a word that was cool, then very much not cool because
Yeah.
parents started using it.
Yeah. Like slay apparently isn't cool anymore.
Slay?
I just started using slay, and no, I don't know.
In
apparently.
charismatic circles, it is.
That's true. It's true.
So
Remains so.
Yeah, little shout out to our charismatic friends.
Mhm.
So maybe the last question here, Irene asked, and this is this will be easy for you. Why are the genealogies in Matthew and Luke different?
Oh yeah, that's a short one. No, great question by the way. But the short answer is because they're actually making different points and they have different audiences. You'll notice that the genealogies actually. So Matthew is writing to primarily a Hebrew audience, or an audience that is at least Judaized in some sense, and so you'll notice that there is a heavy Jewish emphasis on this, and it's going back to a particular point. It's going back to it's pointing to the Davidic line for Jesus, and it's pointing out this, he is the one to come that we've been thinking about for some time. And Luke is more of a Hellenistic audience, and he's got a different audience in mind, and so he's making a different point. Those genealogies, I don't think, if you look at them carefully, don't actually conflict. They rather fit very much like pieces of a puzzle, where you can see the picture all by itself. You know how I liken it? I liken it to those puzzles, and there's these. They're very hard to put together, but they're iridescent puzzles. In other words, if you look at it one way, it's a picture of a dog sitting next to a flower basket or something. But if you look at it slightly differently, now it's a picture of a monkey holding a banana while swinging from a telephone pole. I don't know, and you can put the picture together depending on which angle you're looking at it from, and the puzzle pieces fit all together, but they give a different message in one sense, but they're actually telling the same. It's animal pictures, so to speak. Now that's a rough analogy. I literally just thought of it. So if it's a bad analogy, please don't skewer me over it. But I think that Luke and Matthew are conveying a similar message with a different emphasis. So they're not conflicting genealogies. They're just offering different perspectives. Also, something important to remember is that genealogies in the ancient world didn't have to be exact, and two, didn't have to include everybody. In fact, they frequently didn't include everybody. They would skip entire lines, sometimes generations, because you go from important person to next important person in terms of history and who you'd actually remember. So you have these points that are missing here. What is interesting, and I'm glad you brought up the genealogies, and this is a sort of an excursus. It's not exactly your question, but hopefully that answers your question, is that what the genealogies do include in terms of women and non-Jews is something I reference in the book, More Than a White Man's Religion, as evidence for the fact that, contrary to the popular claims that Christianity doesn't value women, was so patriarchal that women didn't factor into anything, and that it was racist in the sense that it focused solely on Jews, and Jews were God's chosen people. In the genealogies of the Savior of the world, women, including women who weren't Jews, were included in that genealogy, showing their importance and their prominence in Christian thinking from the earliest possible days. So not only are these genealogies telling a story, and genealogies did tell, they weren't just facts, they were facts that told a story. Genealogies had a purpose in the ancient world. It wasn't just to get your sort of 23andMe DNA map of where you came from and what country you hailed from. It's really important in terms of historical context, and it always told a story when a genealogy was important enough to say. So Matthew is trying to tell a story from one perspective. Luke is telling a story from another perspective, and they mesh together quite beautifully because they don't actually conflict. They're just telling different perspectives of the same story.
Yeah, and I know, and there are times where, too, depending on the audience, like you could call Matthew Matthew or Levi. Like there are different names, because I think there's an instance. I think it's the father of Joseph. You know, he's like Heli or Heli in one, and he has another name in another. And some people do talk about, like, oh, it's the difference between one is the genealogy of Mary, the other is the genealogy of Joseph. There's not a lot of necessarily strong proof of that, but that's an option. But to your point, if anyone's interested, there's an ancient writing called we don't have the right, but Fragments of Julius Africanus, and they can read essentially what Abdu is talking about, this idea that one was sort of meant as the royal line, and the other, because I think there's even some debate on, well, there's a son of David that appears to be different in one versus the other, but it could be these different generations, because they're not giving, here's one generation, here's that person's son, here's that person's son, here's that person's son. Because they are sort of being selective based on the story Luke is trying to tell, as Jesus as sort of the representative of all humanity, versus Matthew's story of Jesus as the messianic king come to save his people. So check out, and that's free online. I think Christian Classics Ethereal Library is one where you can find a lot of ancient writings.
And I have a speculation on this, by the way, too, really quickly. This is, take it for what it is, that's speculation. So if you object on speculation, you be sustained. But we talk about Luke and Paul and their interaction together and whether one had an influence on the other. You would necessarily have to have an influence. Paul would necessarily influence Luke to some degree in terms of his theology. And so Paul spends a great amount of time in Romans and other places as well, but Romans as Adam being our representative. And lo and behold, in Luke's genealogy, you find that emphasis. That wouldn't be surprising if, in fact, they knew each other.
Right.
Speculation.
So we've got 1 minute left. We should probably close it down, but I want to mention one thing very quickly. We got an email from Gregory.
Yeah.
And I thought it'd be interesting to talk about it now, because in a lot of these we are saying, we got a comment on the Bart Ehrman episode saying, not a lot of people would disagree with Bart Ehrman on this, but you guys are trying to, one comment actually called us, I think I mentioned it last time, called us desperados, which is like the coolest thing. He meant it as an insult.
I've
I took it
never
as a
been called
compliment.
something so cool before.
It makes me think, wasn't there a Seinfeld episode where that song Desperado kept playing?
And a guy would pause the whole
Yeah.
world just to listen to Desperado.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so thank you, whoever did that. But what do you say about just that quickly? How can I disagree with these scholars? And we may do a longer episode on this idea of authority and scholarly consensus and
We
those
should, in
issues.
fact, do that. And in fact,
Yeah.
there's some good friends of mine who I think I want to actually have on the show. Maybe we can interact with them on the idea of does scholarly consensus mean everything? Because scholarly consensus is a bit of a tricky word, actually. A couple of things on this. I think, one, consensus is a bit of a tricky word because what is consensus today might not be consensus tomorrow. And having said that, what do you define as consensus? A little more than half? What if 40% of scholars believed one thing, but 60% believed 10 different things? So now you have a bunch of minorities and a solid 40%. Is that a consensus? I don't know what the answer actually is. I can tell you this, and again, I'm going to draw on my court of law experience. In fact, this is what we were talking about. We were having a discussion, and I brought this up because I can't help it. But you go to a court of law and you have an expert witness, and this person's a bona fide expert witness. They've gone through the voir dire, they've gone through all the stuff they need to go through under the various tests called the Daubert principle, and the Daubert test for whether someone's an expert and whether someone's opinions that are qualify for admission to a jury and all these things, and they testify and they say X happened, or I believe in these particular instances it's more likely that this person died from this, or that this particle, this part of this machine did this thing and it caused this to catastrophically fail in this way. Then the other side will bring on an equally qualified, just as bona fide, just as well pedigreed expert who says, yeah, I saw the same evidence and it didn't happen that way. And here's my opinion on this. And you cross-examine them. You know who's cross-examining those experts in courts of law? Non-experts, lawyers. We're cross-examining them because we have the right to do so, because one of our expertises is in critical thinking, is thinking, how do I understand or put this person's views to the test? I, as a lawyer, know how to do that. Does that mean that you have to be a lawyer to know how to critique Bart Ehrman's conclusions, or Paula Fredriksen's, or Hugh Ross's, our good friend Hugh Ross's, or William Lane Craig's, or you name the Norm Geisler, you name the person? No, you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. All you have to do is be a person who has some critical thinking skills and be able to say, I don't know if I buy that or not. I'm going to look into it. And then you can critique it. Just because they have a PhD after their name, just because I have a JD after mine, or someone has an MPhil or an MA or a whatever after their names, doesn't immunize them from criticism. Absolutely not. So yes, I can disagree with them because I think that and you, by the way, all of you, we do this in fact because we trust that you will engage in critical thinking. We want to hear from you. You have the ability to test whether an expert's telling the truth. Now, if someone says, look, I'm an expert in biblical languages, and that word doesn't mean this thing, you should give them some weight. They have credibility. You don't discount them because they're an expert who doesn't agree with you, but you don't give them more weight than they deserve just because they're an expert either. You give them their due weight, an appropriate amount of weight. And so I think we can assess the experts, give them the due reference, the reverence in one sense, and the respect they're due based on their years of learning, but also recognize that sometimes there's some faulty logic that is applied. And there's no reason that just because they have a PhD or multiple PhDs that they're somehow immune from that. We do it in courts of law all the time, and we can do it in our lives all the time. And just be careful that you don't over-criticize and become cynical. But don't lose your, I believe, God-given right to be an honest and sincere skeptic of people's opinions just because they have a lot of letters after their name. Which I think goes into this email that Greg sent to us, is that he wanted us to react, and we're probably going to do this. We're going to react to a video that he sent to us about a skeptic from a YouTube channel called Good Mythical Morning. And I'm going to respond. I haven't watched the video yet, so please bear this in mind. Rhett McLaughlin says that he left Christianity at least partially because he felt like he did not have the right to tell experts that they were wrong. And there were experts who were saying that, this didn't happen and this didn't happen and that kind of thing. And so he's like, my goodness, who am I to say that they're wrong? Well, there are as qualified experts who say, though, that what the Bible said is actually true on many accounts and many claims. There are equally as expertise of scientists who believe that the Bible is telling you the right thing. So, by the same logic of I left the faith because I couldn't tell these experts they were wrong, who denied the Christian faith, what makes you think you have the right to tell experts who affirm the Christian faith that they're wrong?
Yeah.
In other words, being an expert doesn't give you this mystical quality of infallibility. And it doesn't mean that you are somehow subordinated in your abilities to think through things just because you're not an expert. Give them their due reverence. Give them their due respect. But don't forget, you have your own critical thinking abilities, and you should exercise them as well.
Yeah, Lance asked a good question earlier and said, how else do we get to the truth without the freedom to speak and question?
Indeed.
So that's true for the Retts of the world who kind of put the whole deconstruction thing on the map on his show, but also for us, because we are critical thinking beings who we can read, we can look, we can reason, and we can see the evidence for what it is and get other perspectives. So
I never would have become a Christian had I not been given the freedom to challenge the experts and to agree with the experts. I think that's an important part of it. You were given the freedom to do that. Come, let us reason, the Bible says.
Yeah.
And if God can let you if God can be questioned and He lets you do that, I think we can question a few experts too.
Yeah. Well, Abdu, that's it for today. I want to thank also real quick John Sternfels for the shout out. He said he appreciates you and your ministry.
Oh my goodness, John, it's so good. Wow, it's so good to hear from you. I hope you're doing well, my friend. Man, we should connect soon.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, again, it's more important than ever to subscribe, click the bell, make sure you get notifications so you know the next time we go live. Probably not in 2 weeks, but you never know when we may be popping up. So keep.
Now it's mysterious.
Yeah. You got to wait. It's like whack-a-mole. Hope you can catch us in time. But yeah, we will see you when we see you. And All Rise, of course, will be out next week on Monday, and that is a conversation with Hugh Ross.
Yes.
On the James Webb Telescope. Yeah.
Great conversation with you. Don't miss it.
Yeah. All right. Well, God bless you guys. We'll see you.